Ha! I love that little ditty. Hi, everyone. It's Haley Mirr again. Welcome back to our Lay of the Land series. I'm the Director of Operations at Mirr Ranch Group, and every other week, we're going to discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, and the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners across the West. Mirr Ranch Group, for those of you who this is your first time tuning in, is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches, sporting, and conservation properties around the West. And today, one of the most important things that our clients face is conservation issues and conservation benefits. So today we're going to be talking about conservation in Colorado and what ranchers and landowners should know going into the process of purchasing a property. Thank you to everyone once again for submitting your questions. We'll try to get them on this broadcast, but please feel free to keep asking them during this session. If we don't get to all of them during this podcast, we will answer all your questions after this. Helping me, as always, today is the founder of Mirr Ranch Group, Ken Mirr. Ken is a board member of Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, and beyond that has been a longtime contributor to conservation in Colorado for over 20 years, since I was even we taught at a couple different organizations. So I've grown up with it too. But without further ado, here's Ken.
Hello, how are you? Hey.
Hello. I'm good. So Ken is actually tuning in from Fort Myers, Florida. How is it down there?
Good. The Southeast office is alive and well. Thank you.
Good. Glad to have you on board as always. And in addition to Ken, we're also going to be joined by one of our dear friends and the executive director of Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, Erik Glenn. Erik Glenn has led Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust into being one of probably the best land trusts in Colorado. They have, I think, they cover more ground than any other land trust in the state, if I'm correct, Ken. And then beyond that, they also received the Land Trust Alliance Excellence Award in 2017 by the Land Trust Alliance. So he's really done a really incredible job. And who better to talk to us about conservation than Erik Glenn? So without further ado, here's Erik.
Hi, how are you?
We're great. How are you doing?
Doing well. I wished I was in Florida and you could send some of that rain west, Ken.
Yeah, I've got some baggies out there. I'll be putting them on the plane tomorrow, so we're good. Erik, thanks for joining. And yes, Erik and I go way back. He's been engaged with the land trust for a long time, and so it's good to be. I'm on the board with him, so I he's my leader, so I look up to him, and he takes me through the ins and outs of conservation, not just in Colorado, but all over the place. And he's actually been instrumental in setting up and helping foster land trusts and conservation organizations in other states throughout the West. So congrats there, Erik. Thanks for all that you do.
Well, thanks for having me, and look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Well, I guess what we'll kind of start this discussion with is the history of conservation in Colorado, and in a broader sense, just what a conservation easement actually is. Because a lot of, we hear conservation easements, but I think a lot of the people tuning in would love to know a little more about what a conservation easement actually is. So I guess, Erik, do you want to take it first?
Sure. Well, and when we talk about conservation today, we'll mostly focus on conservation easements, which is a very specific tool within the conservation tool bag, which is pretty broad. But I think we first have to start by recognizing that our agricultural producers and our landowners that steward private lands are the true stewards, the true conservationists. And regardless of whether or not they do conservation easements or not, they're all applying some conservation measures on their properties in that stewardship on a daily basis. And we are so blessed in Colorado and throughout the West to have these landowners who take great pride and have great passion in stewarding these lands, and we all benefit from it. And so I think we need to just start and level set with that. And then we can talk about kind of the history of this formal conservation and specifically conservation easements in Colorado, which goes back to the 1970s. And when the enabling statute for conservation easements first showed up in the Colorado revised statutes. And then as we moved forward throughout the last 5 decades, we've seen conservation and conservation easements expand significantly. I think in the late 1970s was when the first easement was done in Colorado. I think there was probably a dozen or so in the 80s, and then in the late 90s it really kind of took off as landowners recognized that easements could be a tool to help them with estate planning, and it could be a tool to help keep agriculture at scale in a state that was quickly developing. And that scale piece is important for agriculture, because once you start losing scale, then your scale of agriculture, then your input costs go up. It makes it more difficult to operate. And easements have been a good tool in Colorado that enable us to keep scale. And that's really important. And so your second question about what is an easement, simply put, it's a deed restriction on the land that restricts what certain types of things you can do. And mostly, if you're talking about a working lands conservation easement, which is what we focus on, you're talking about restricting where you can put improvements, and it's mostly to do with major improvements, so houses, large barns, riding arenas, stuff like that. Minor agricultural structures like windmills, stock tanks, you can put those within a working lands easement wherever you want. There's no limitation on those things. What we're really trying to do through a conservation easement on an agricultural property is focus the major improvements in existing, where the existing major improvements are, and maybe one or two other locations if the landowner so desires, and also keeping that property as a single unit in most instances.
Yeah, so to your point, I guess, are all conservation easements written the same, a little different? You said you guys work with working conservation easements. I know there's some that are out there, but are they all kind of created equal, or are there a lot of caveats that buyers and sellers should be aware of?
Even before that, I mean, there's such a history though too. I mean, when he was talking about Colorado, and I mean, these easements historically go way back too. I mean, from East Coast and things that migrated, and ideas of land conservation that weren't necessarily always associated with working landscapes either, Eric, probably, right? A little open space, and there's different reasons why easements were created in some respect. But I guess always going back to the idea that it is a deed restriction, but it's a kind of a deed restriction that you get some benefits from doing so beyond just putting it in a deed. Now you've got some other things that we'll talk about, but and that goes into now, as you kind of talk about, what are they all created equal? Because many times we have a client, saying, "Oh, there's an easement on it. I don't like them because it takes this, and this away." Well, you got to read it, right? So.
Yeah, I skipped over probably about 150 years of conservation history across the country, but I wanted to focus really on Colorado. And I would argue, we've kind of perfected working lands conservation easements here at Colorado Cattlemen's over the last 27 years that we've been in existence. But all easements each easement's unique. And that's what is important for landowners to understand as you're looking at this tool, is that it is a document that you're going to negotiate with the easement holder, and potentially with some other partners that might be involved as well. But there are template easements, and there are organizations that will simply use a template organization and say, here's that template, and we're not going to change much about it. But and that's where it's beholden upon landowners to really pick their partners wisely and do their due diligence. If you're going to go down this road, there's a lot of options out there, and you can find the right option for you as a landowner, and what your needs and wants and goals and objectives are. And I think that's what's really important to understand is we can, within certain parameters, we can create as much or as a little flexibility in that easement as you as a landowner want. Now, the more flexibility you want in that easement for the future, the less value that easement's going to create. The more restrictive the easement is, the more value it creates. And so there's a balance for landowners that we work with as we move through kind of facilitating these transactions. I think an important point, though, and there's a lot of misinformation about easements, and there's a lot of misinformation right now about easements that's circulating around, that if you do an easement, that you're giving your land to the federal government, and that is just completely unfounded. And there's a belief out there that if you do an easement, and let's say you're a rancher and you ranch and you run Black Angus cattle, that you'll have to run Black Angus cattle for the rest of perpetuity. And again, it's just not the case. These easements, if particularly when done right, they really don't get into management. Easements are really a durability tool, meaning they're about keeping land intact to either be productive agricultural land, to be wildlife habitat, to be open space, to protect scenic viewscapes. They're not meant to say you landowner have to manage in a certain way, because they're perpetual documents. It would be absolutely wrong-headed to put prescriptive management practices in a perpetual document. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't happen. It does happen on occasion. And again, that's where you got to pick your partner right.
Right. And I mean, I guess, as Ken was even alluding to, there's been conservation easements throughout, the 150 years that you skipped. But why has it become so effective in Colorado? Like, what has Colorado done to make it so that it is such a benefit to landowners?
The biggest thing we've done in Colorado is create incentives around conservation. So Coloradans have, going back to statehood, have identified themselves with the natural resources of the state. It's kind of who we are as people. It's who this state is. It's how we're largely defined. And because of that, we want to maintain that. And we want to maintain that for future generations. And one way to do that is to incentivize landowners to voluntarily conserve their lands for future generations. And we have the most robust set of conservation incentives in the country. We have Great Outdoors Colorado, which takes lottery proceeds in the state and applies them to helping purchase conservation easements on working lands and other lands across the state. We have a state tax credit, and this tax credit's actually transferable, meaning if you don't have a lot of state income tax liability, you can sell that credit to another taxpayer and get cash from that, which is really important for farmers and ranchers, but it's also a nice incentive for other landowners in the state as well. And those two funding sources are unique to Colorado. There's only, I think, 3 other states in the country that have a transferable tax credit. There's no state in the country that has such a robust lottery funding program as what GOCO is. There's some other states that where a percentage of lottery proceeds will go to open space and natural resource conservation. But in Colorado, a vast majority of it goes here. And then we have the other kind of national incentives that exist and that you can largely utilize anywhere in the country. That's federal farm bill programs. There are programs within the U.S. Department of Interior, specifically through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some other agencies, resource agencies under that branch of government. And then we also have state and local, county and municipal open space programs. So throughout Colorado, there are several counties that have open space funding programs. Routt County, Steamboat Springs area is probably the most well-known in this space. It's been around for almost 25 years and it's done some incredible work in the Yampa Valley. But all the Front Range counties, from kind of the state line of Wyoming down to New Mexico, largely have these programs. And then most of the resort communities will have open space programs too. So when you put all that together, there's just a huge tool, a lot of opportunities for landowners who are interested in continuing that legacy of stewardship to be able to do that instead of having to look just towards selling off parcels of their land to find extra cash flow.
The old back 40 scenario, right? Sell off the back 40,
right?
Which I realize that's where it came from, right? It was the idea of the great income. You know, as you talk about those things too, Erik, I think about, we do have a robust program in Colorado compared to other places. Like I'll go into, places like Arizona, for instance, and there's hardly any incentive, within the state other than some of the federal tax. But even with all the incentives, I kind of learned a long time ago too, you still have to have some charitable intent. Right? When you approach these things, because they're in perpetuity. And that's the whole idea. There has to be some charitable intent. Do you still agree with that concept behind these?
I would tell you that every landowner we work with that does conservation, and they do it voluntarily, it's not at its essence about the financial elements. It is about the other components. It is about the legacy that those families have had, in some cases, the day back 100 plus years on that same parcel, and they want to ensure that that will continue in that fashion. And that's what drives them to do it. The financial incentives are really just there to as a way to say, I think for the public to say what you're doing and what you've done for the last 100 plus years is valuable to us as the public. And we have never, as the public, we have never fully compensated landowners for all the things they do that we benefit from. We compensate them through the commodity that they raise. It might be crops, it might be livestock, but all the other things that they do and they provide back to the citizens of this state and the citizens of the country, we have never, the general public has never compensated landowners for those things. And so really, I think when you look at conservation, landowners are doing it because they love the land, they love what they do, they want that kind of tradition and that legacy to continue, whether it's in their family or not. That's, I think most of them want it to continue in their family, but that's not always an option for people. Right. But the financial perspective and component of it is really, when I look at it, is more of a way for society to kind of show that value for those other elements that we've never paid for. And I don't think we'll probably ever fully compensate
Realize it. Yeah.
landowners for the full suite of things and benefits that they provide to society. And so, and I think that's important for us all to recognize.
And I want to do a shout out that concept of charitable intent always came from Bill Silverstein, attorney who we've all worked with over the years, or Larry Keeter. But that was it. I mean, and that, those are those things that just resonate with you each time you look at these things. And those folks who laid that groundwork early on, you got to keep teaching people that's part of the message here, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a great story that Jay Fetcher, who helped found Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Land Trust in the early 90s as a rancher and steamboat, and he tells the story. They were one of the early adopters of conservation easements, and they did so because of the need to find a way to transition the ranch from Jay's dad to Jay. And when Jay's dad was about to pass, he was put on oxygen and went to hospice. And the doctor told Jay that his dad couldn't ever go back to the ranch and ranch again. And Jay said he told his dad that, and his dad took off the oxygen mask and died within an hour, because what it meant to him, the ranching component of this, the stewardship component of the ranch, was what gave him life. And
Mm-hmm.
if he couldn't do that, it wasn't, it was time to go. And I think when you talk about that charitable intent, Ken, it's about, this is from the heart and from the soul of these landowners, the vast majority of them. And to have the privilege to engage with these folks in these really deep and meaningful ways is one of the great honors of my life, and I will always value that and cherish it. And I hope others get that experience too.
Right. It knocks away all the subterfuge of nonsense that goes out there sometimes about these issues, when you take it back to that level, right? I mean, so anyways, don't want to dwell on it, but it really is.
No,
it is the redeeming aspect of everything that is done in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond the beauty, just enjoying the landscapes ourselves because they are protected, which is, why I'm a big proponent as well.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of like why one of our pillars, even at Mirr Ranch Group, is that kind of conservation side and finding those buyers and helping them leave their legacy. So it's cool to partner with people like you, Erik, to make that a reality for a lot of people. And not to, continue, but just like an educational component, beyond just the benefits and things, kind of what are the most recent updates? Like, are things changing? I know we've had easements in Colorado for as long as we have, but I know there's been a lot of change recently. Can you speak to a little bit of some of the bills that have passed, the state of conservation in Colorado?
Well, I would tell you that the state of conservation in this state has never been stronger. Landowner interest is as high as we've ever seen it before. Landowners want to continue stewarding those properties. They don't want to sell. They want to do what they're good at doing. And we last year were able to get a significant win in the legislature to adjust the state tax credit to allow landowners to claim up to 90% of the value of their conservation easement in the form of a state tax credit. And that increased that credit incentive. Before that legislation passed, landowners could claim roughly about 55%. Now they're able to claim up to 90%. We needed to do that because when that incentive was put in place in the early 2000s, it was a good incentive at that time. And if you think about these purely from an economics standpoint, an incentive is supposed to be incentivizing action. And as costs and inflation occurred within conservation and within land just over time, the incentive became less of an incentive. It became less effective. And so we needed to make that change because the voters of the state of Colorado continue to say conservation was important. Landowners kept telling us that they wanted to have the tool available to them, but the incentive needed to work better. And so
That's a huge win.
we were able to secure that victory in the legislature last year. It opens up conservation in new areas of the state too. There are certain places where, even though you have a strong charitable intent, if doing the easement's going to cost you more than you get out of it financially, you're not going to do that in most cases. And so what we needed to make sure is that for landowners who do choose to do this, that they're not going to lose money on it.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be a significant charitable component to it, but you don't want landowners to lose money. There would be no reason for them to do it at that point. And so these changes have I think created recreated that incentive to work efficiently from an incentive standpoint, and that's what we wanted to try to accomplish. And so demand interest is up. We see it from landowners across the state, and we're able to do conservation in more places. And I think that's an important point for people to recognize, is that, I think most people think conservation easements and conservation, they think the mountains, the places that I think people most identify with Colorado. But some of the most important lands from a conservation standpoint, from an ag standpoint, are in the eastern plains or in the northwestern corners that aren't the iconic mountain landscapes that we think about when we think about Colorado, but are really important in conservation. Historically hasn't worked in those areas as well. And so this change, the incentive, allows us to open conservation up to more parts of the state too, which is really important.
And I think that addresses a bit of that fallacy too, that these only benefit the wealthy, and quite frankly, the credit itself has really benefited the ordinary, rancher, fourth, fifth generation rancher, because of the federal tax, income tax benefit was really not applicable to them. So these have been really, what I've seen as I've been participating so long with the organization, was that aspect of it itself. And it was a great learning opportunity for me to see how that works and how it has benefited. And, clearly states like Wyoming don't need that income tax credit because they don't have state income tax, but some of these other areas that don't. New Mexico's seen certainly some opportunities. And I think you go back to, I think when we first created that tax credit, it wasn't a lot of oversight, I guess, you'd say, back in the day. And because of regulations within the state, to kind of make sure that things are on the up and up as far as appraisals and quality of appraisals and things like that, really gone to secure that tax credit and make people actually feel a lot more secure about what they're doing, as long as they follow those appropriate steps. And just one other thing I might add is, the cost sharing programs that you talk about, it's not inexpensive to do an easement in and of itself. The legal, the accounting, the appraisals, the baseline inventories, all the things that do go on do cost money just for the transaction in and of itself. So there are wonderful, things out there for the non-wealthy to do these things and get compensated for those programs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would say what really makes this program equitable is the transferability of the credit.
Yeah.
If it was just designed for the wealthy, as some people would argue, if you took the transferability of that credit out, then yes, it would largely just be for the wealthy. The transferability of the credit opens this program up much more to any landowner that really wants to look at conservation, because by allowing that credit to be sold for cash, creates an opportunity for landowners that don't have large tax liabilities to then participate and take advantage of those incentives. And that's a really key component. And I think, the transferability piece was put in there largely because a few state legislators and talking to landowners like Jay Fetcher, Bill Fales, and folks like that across the state recognized that, we needed to preserve working agricultural lands for the future of the state. And to do so, we needed to find an incentive that worked for those folks that don't have significant income tax liabilities.
Right. But, and in my world too, it's both. I mean, a lot of our clients are high net worth individuals that do participate in those things. But again, it still goes back to some of the donative intent and why they're doing that. And it's really never all motivated by the tax part. The interest in the conservation comes first.
Yep.
Or preserving the legacy.
And just to break up the conversation a little bit, we've had a few questions come in about some of conservation easements and how they relate to landowners, buyers, sellers. Someone messaged and said, "I've heard a conservation easement can diminish the value of a property. Is that true?" I know a lot of people when they come in, they're like, we don't want X, Y, and Z, or we do want X, Y, and Z. What do you guys have to say about kind of that old wives' tale that it diminishes the value of a property overall?
I mean, it's sort of what it's intended to do, right? You're restricting the property or placing restrictions on it, so there's less that you can do with that property as the owner. And that is how you create value for that conservation easement. It's the difference between the unencumbered, meaning you can do largely what you want with it, and the encumbered value, that's your conservation value. So it does. I mean, it's intended to do that. The problem that we've recently been seeing is that the marketplace doesn't necessarily indicate that that's happening. So we've seen properties with easements sell for as much, or in some instances even more, than properties that are similar without easements. And we're seeing that not just in Colorado, we're seeing it in Montana, Idaho, kind of across the West. And part of that is, I would argue, and Ken, you and I could probably get into a long debate about this on real estate trends, but I would argue we're seeing some of that because the early adopters of conservation easements, a lot of them had some of the best habitat.
Right.
They had some of the best resources, and they were some of the best stewards. And so when you put those lands up in the marketplace, and you got a buyer who's coming in who wants to purchase the property for maybe a private retreat, maybe they want to purchase it for hunting, whatever, and they compare a property with an easement that still allows them to do all the things they want to do, but it's got better resources than a property that's unencumbered, but the resources aren't quite as good. Do you really care if it's got an easement on it or not?
Right.
There's a point, right?
Things you want to do with it.
Well, it goes back to that adage when I was in law school, right? They said property's about a bundle of sticks, right? You got all these sticks. So these conservation easements, do you have 100 sticks to your property values? Well, are you taking 2 out to do this easement? Are you taking 5 out? Are you, what is that? What level of impact are you doing? And that really goes back to the terms of the easement. You got air rights, you got subsurface rights, you have all these things. And I think people sometimes just think like these things are all prohibit so many uses. And it comes down to, it really is about building envelopes and, or number of residences or things like that. It's not necessarily, oh no, you can't have deer, can't hunt, you can't graze your cows, you can't do this and that. And it goes to the nature of the industry of making sure that the model easements that we use are good. They're negotiated between, the landowner and the land trust. And it's always good to have advice as to what because it is in perpetuity. So you want to kind of look back at it and say, is this work? And that's the beauty of the Cattlemens. And the way I look at it, I become very comforted when I know, as I look at, if I'm going to represent a property, that it has a cattleman's easement, I have a better understanding of what that is going forward than sometimes other organizations, because it is that focus on the working landscapes, and it really is just tightening up. In some of these places, you want it for development, well, then don't do an easement if you're a landowner, right? But if you want to preserve the working nature of that, then it might be a great idea, but you could still, what, you want 3 home sites, you want 5 on 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres? What is that number? That's all freely negotiated, though. And that's why I think sometimes people get, I think they have the mixed message is something's imposed when it's, like you said, it's free will, it's negotiated.
Right. Well, to that point, then, we just had another question that came in that is a good segue from this, but does this mean that the future buyers of this land that is encumbered will be encumbered with those same restrictions in perpetuity that were negotiated in the contract?
Yeah, so at least in there, again, I think an important point is there are many different types of conservation easements. There are actually non-perpetual conservation easements, but for the most part, when you hear the term conservation easement, you're going to be thinking about it from a perpetual standpoint, and meaning that those terms that were originally negotiated by the landowner who granted the easement are going to carry forward to new owners. And so as a buyer, and when these properties come up, it's really important to understand what those terms are. Can you live with them? Do they allow you to do what you want to do with that property? And again, I think it's just like the landowners who choose to do a conservation easement, which is a choice and it's voluntary. Buyers who buy properties with conservation easements, that's a choice too, and they do it. They should be able to do it with their eyes wide open and fully knowing and understanding what the terms of the easement are. And the easements are recorded, and so they show up on your title. And there's no reason for buyers to not fully understand those. And at Cattlemen's, we'll take questions from brokers, we'll take questions from prospective buyers all the time. What does this mean? And we're happy to kind of walk through and talk to folks about those things.
And what's great is, like, even going through title, when I've gone through title with clients, like, conservation easements are one of the easiest things to kind of understand because they are so well written out. You have the resources to ask the questions. Some of the other encumbrances you find on properties are a little bit harder to understand. So it's nice that, for the most part, these things are written out and clear when you're going through the process.
Go to the prohibited and permitted uses. Let's see if it allows subdivision. Look at the conservation purposes. I mean, these are things that you know what to look at and how to interpret. And usually there's exhibits and other things that help you. For those who are listening that say, hey, how do I know? Well, these are things that readily available to look at, to understand, and just knowing where to go to the guts of those instruments and knowing what those restrictions are. It's important to understand those. But like I said, I over the years have worked with lots of different groups. Again, when it comes to working lands, these agricultural easements and working land easements are, I just find much more, I call it charitable, in that they're not so impactful on what you do with your land. I mean, nobody wants to be there. Cattlemen's the first thing. I know how it costs to steward these things and the stewardship costs on the organization of itself. We want to make sure that these are well defined, so nobody's getting into lawsuits or other things to interpret these items, right?
Right. And I guess with that perpetuity stuff that we've been talking about, I mean, there are some things happening in other states that I know a little bit in Nebraska, Montana, that are kind of trying to take away some of that component of the easement. We kind of talked about it a little bit before this, but
yeah, again, it goes back to misconceptions about what easements are, how they're used, what they can and can't do. That there's a segment of policymakers right now that are bent on prohibiting landowners from taking part in perpetual easements. And to me, all you're doing is inhibiting somebody's private property rights further. And
Right.
the funny part is that the proponents of these legislative initiatives are saying we're the champions of private property rights and preserving your property rights, because we're telling people they can't do, they shouldn't have the option to do a perpetual conservation easement. And as someone who grew up in the West, who grew up in a very conservative community and a conservative family, it's just preposterous to me to think that somebody would come in and say, we're going to take away certain rights from landowners to make choices about what they want to do with their private property rights. And the counter argument to that is, well, when you put a perpetual easement on, you've taken the rights away from future generations. Well, anytime you make a decision with your land, you're making decisions that are going to impact future generations. If you sell that land for development, it's not coming back to be a farm or ranch. And so the argument to me just falls flat. What we need to be doing is preserving landowners' ability to make decisions as best we possibly can. Can we make easements better? Yeah, absolutely. Can we do things to advance conservation that helps those future generations? Similar to what having more tools available to them? Absolutely. I think one of the things that I get excited about is, let's look at, okay, we put a conservation easement on a piece of property. That really, the financial benefit is all largely to that first generation. What can we do to help the second, third, fourth, fifth generations and advance additional conservation gains for those properties? And there's a lot of things we can do working together to do that. And that's where we should be focusing our time versus saying, you shouldn't do conservation easements. And I think it's important to think through visuals when we're talking about these things. So for us in Colorado, and anybody that's been to Denver, if you've ever driven towards Colorado Springs, when you get south of Castle Rock, the towns go away and you're presented with these great views of open rolling plains and bluffs, much as it would have been back when the settlers arrived here.
Greenland Ranch and all that.
Yeah, and it's always going to look like that because of a conservation easement. Imagine what a blessing that is for all of us in the state to have that versus a continuous segment of strip mall all the way down to Colorado Springs. And
like what we see up north to Fort Collins.
Or you go to Texas, look between San Antonio and Austin, right? I mean, all that has become one giant developed area. And and I don't begrudge anybody for wanting to develop their land. I mean, that's your
landowner's right.
But thankfully, there's landowners that say, I'd rather see this continue this way, and we should all be grateful for that.
So I guess that's a great leading, just the future of conservation. Are there any new initiatives down the road or things that you're excited about working at CCALT that you would like to share with Ken and I?
So one of the things we're doing at CCALT, and it's not, there's other groups that are doing this, but I call it additive conservation. How do we take an easement or a property that has an easement on it and add additional conservation programs on top of that benefit the landowner? And we're really focusing on that. And part of that stems from the fact that when we were created by the membership of the Cattlemen's Association in 1995, the charge to us was to be a service provider to their membership and to landowners across the state. And if we are going to be a service provider, and we have to find new ways to continue to help those landowners and assist those landowners achieve their goals for their property, that have partnered with us on a conservation easement. And so we're really digging into what that looks like moving forward. It could be any of these emerging ecosystem service markets, layering those on top of an easement. It could be as simple as helping them with water infrastructure and improving that water infrastructure that may have been deferred maintenance, may have been an issue in the past. So how can we connect with our landowner partners and help them further achieve their goals? And so we're really excited about that from an internal organizational perspective, but from a broader kind of perspective, I think some of the things that I'm excited about are looking at, is there a different way to value conservation easements? Let's value them based on the conservation gains that we're achieving versus valuing them on some hypothetical loss of development rights on a property. We're working on that with a number of partners across the state and across the West on ways in which we can value conservation for conservation, and I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. Well, and that gets to your point. If usually at this point, if you're in an area that's influenced by resort, for instance, the value of your easement goes up because your proximity to a resort or high valued real estate, for instance. But the resources that may be preserved on plains or other places further removed, the resource values that you're protecting are actually much, much greater, but your values based on the current methodology are lower because there's no kind of development value there. And I think that intrinsically that needs to change, because you're not really truly measuring the impact by what you're doing. So,
and the other thing we're not doing is helping, I think, the general public recognize the importance of working lands and open space. These properties, by staying open and not being developed, are actually providing significant economic value back to urban centers like Denver, Fort Collins, wherever. And we, as the citizens that live there, and I live in the Denver metro area, and we're never paying for those things. And we actually don't know what the value of them are, because of what those services are, because nobody's ever really dug into it. Now there's lots of resource economists now and throughout the country that are saying, this is what these things are worth. And by valuing conservation for conservation, people will, I think, have a deeper respect for understanding of what the value of water is in this state. We all talk about in the West how valuable water is, but you go talk to most people in the Front Range communities, they'll say, yeah, water is valuable. They really don't fully understand just how valuable water is and why it's valuable. And we need to change that. We need to educate people, if we're going to continue to have a really wonderful place to live in the future.
I love that. Education. And I guess, just kind of ending all of this, is there anything that the people viewing and the people viewing after this live stream can do with Colorado Cattlemen's beyond going to your website and learning more?
Well, I mean, like any 501c3 charity, we're always looking for folks who want to get passionate about land conservation and working lands conservation and make charitable donations to us that we put back into the land. A fun stat for us is that for every $25 that we raise, we can save 1 acre of land or conserve 1 acre of land in perpetuity. And that's a pretty good, Ken, what's the average value of an acre in Colorado? It's substantially higher than $25, but
I'd like to find that somewhere.
But needless to say, the biggest thing for me, I think, is really for people to get passionate about understanding why agriculture and production agriculture is important to the state. It's important to the West. It's important to the nation. If we become a net importer of food, similar to where we were with oil years ago. That's a really scary situation to think about. And if we don't get serious about conserving lands and promoting agriculture in the state, we could face that at some point in the future. Probably not in our lifetimes, but we do need to be smart about our planning and thoughtful about why agriculture and food production is really critical to a healthy and meaningful life.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time and everything that Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust does for the state. I know some of my favorite landscapes have been protected because of you guys. So we appreciate all you do. And Ken, as always, I appreciate everything you do for conservation and otherwise. But thank you again for those who have tuned in. If you have any other questions about conservation and how that impacts land values or what you should be looking for as a buyer, please let us know, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Erik.
Thank you. Have a good day.
See ya.